All right. Well, I think we're officially recorded now. So, parents, leaders, CFC, excited about the opportunity that we have to have two guys on here, this interview that have both impacted me personally, but have also had a pretty big impact in our ministry at senior high. So, at the top of my screen, I've got Will Rutt. He is the youth pastor in Florence, South Carolina at Sandhurst. And so the three of us were all together last night. And then at the bottom of my screen, we got Matt Densky, who's the youth pastor at Fellowship Greenville. So want to hear from both of them in just a second. But Will, first tell us how long you've been in youth ministry, and then tell us about this podcast that you have.
7 years I've been at Sandhurst and working with middle school and high schoolers, and I love it. And so we do a parent podcast that we put out every week. And the goal is to partner with parents to help them disciple their kids, because we think that's like the parents are the primary disciplers for their kids. And so we just want to partner with them in that.
Okay. All right, awesome. And you've been at you said for 7 years?
7 years, yeah.
Awesome. And then where did you go to college at?
CIU.
Okay. Yeah. So all three of us are at CIU. In fact, we were on the leadership team together under Mike Thompson. We were all RAs for a time together. So that was awesome. All right, Matt, tell us how long you've been in youth ministry.
Yeah, I stepped into youth ministry in 2006. So I'm in my 14th year.
Okay. And how long have you been in Greenville?
Greenville, South Carolina. I've been up here now for almost 4 years. This September will be 4 years.
That's awesome, man. Hey, tell us real quick for both of you guys, what is something that's kept you in youth ministry? So, Will, why don't you go first?
What has kept me in youth ministry? I guess the fact that I really love it. I like students. I like the fun. I like the fun stuff. I like the spiritual stuff, and that's probably it. I love it.
Yeah, you're good at the fun. Last night, the game that you did, I mean, of course, CFC came out on top. We won, but appreciate you leading the game last night on our Zoom. So parents, leaders, if you didn't see that, we had like 100 people on Zoom, 3 churches together combined. So it was a great time. All right, Matt, tell us what has kept you in youth ministry these 14 years.
Yeah, well, I know, Jonathan, for you, it's been the paycheck. Like, we've talked about that, just all the money you make. For me, it's a little different though. Man, honestly, like I didn't grow up with Jesus. I didn't grow up with the church, and I came to know Jesus when I was 16 years old, and it was a pretty radical 180 for me in my life. And about a month and a half after I trusted in Jesus, I was in this worship service, and I was brought to my knees in just this awe of God in this moment. And I sensed God speaking to my heart and saying something along the lines of, I want you to do for other teenagers what I've done for you. And he just started to cultivate a deep-seated passion in me for the next generation, which I believe is modeled by God in the scriptures. Like in the Old Testament, look at how often he's referred to as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Multiple generations are included within the name of God, the title of God. So the heart of God is always for the next generation. And then Jesus himself, as we read the Gospels, we tend to think of Jesus as this kind of old dude, but Jesus was younger than all of us in this chat right now. Or maybe, Will, I think you're a couple years.
I'm 29.
Yeah, so Jesus was just a little bit older than you, but he's 30-year-old guy. And the disciples, I don't know about you guys, but my whole life I imagine them as middle-aged, balding, smelly dudes. These were teenage boys. These were 13, 14, 15-year-old guys, which would have been appropriate for the culture there for a public rabbi to call adulthood was considered at 13. But in our worldview, they would have been teenagers. And so it's just really interesting. The heart of God has always been geared for the next generation. And clearly Jesus loves the next generation and young people. So, man, I'm passionate about him. It's the most impressionable season of life. After the age of 18, statistically, it's much, much harder to place your faith in Jesus. So if you can make an impact in those formative years, it it pays off dividends in the long run.
Well, that's awesome. So the Lord made an impact in your life and then challenged you to then go and do that for others. And so, man, I know the Lord has used you a lot, both at the church, because you're at a church in South Carolina for a little bit, in Lexington, right?
Yeah,
so,
Lexington.
Yeah, the Lord's using you, man. Hey, so Matt, Will and I want to ask you a few questions. I know that over the last 14 years, you've put a lot of work into studying and try to understand the students that the Lord has called you to really make an impact in their life. I know that over the last several years, you've spoken in a lot of different youth groups. Most recently, I think you've been to a youth group in Austin. You've been to Mississippi. You've been here to Jacksonville. You've been up to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So you've been around a lot of different youth groups, and you kind of know what life is like for them. Although you've been removed from high school for 14 or 15 years. Tell us something that you've learned about Gen Z before COVID happened over the last month or so.
Yeah. Man, Jonathan, you ask good questions, bro. You're a good question asker. Just so everyone knows, this is officially recorded. You know, I want people to know how good you are.
Appreciate it.
Man, what I've learned over the years is, well, I'm going to answer this in a long way to kind of get to a short answer. When I first got into student ministry, my approach was, man, I'm a young guy. I'm single. I'm in college. I don't have many responsibilities in life. I thought I did at that time, but looking back, nothing. And so I just put all my time into students. I ran hard after students for about 6 years. That was my strategy of student ministry. Disciple students, spend time with students, hang out with students, be with students, and all that's great. Like, that's needed. But what I was overlooking completely was the parent. And about 6 or 7 years into student ministry, I was just convicted and confronted by God with this truth of, like, who do you think you are? Like, how can you think that you're going to replace the people that I've established to be the primary influencers in the lives of these students? You're on a team. You're a complementary investor with your influence. You're not the primary influencer. And that was a pretty radical revelation for me. On the best year possible, if a student came to every event, hung out with me, anytime I asked or whatever, came to every weekly worship service, came to the retreats, the best year possible, I might get to see that student 100 hours within the year, factoring in about 2 hours a week-ish. The average parent gets to spend over 3,000 hours with that same student. It's not, I have nothing compared to the parent. And so about 7 years in, I began to realize effective student ministry means effective parent ministry. And so I switched up my entire trajectory and my strategy and began to approach parents. But I knew that in order to do that, I would have to bring something valuable enough to parents that they would say, okay, this young guy knows a thing or two, and he's a good resource. Let's partner together. Because at that time I wasn't a parent. Now I'm a father of 2 boys. I have a little girl coming in 3 weeks, terrified to join the girl club. So
that's awesome.
pray for me, guys.
I love having girls. I have 2 girls. Will's got, I think, 8 girls.
Something like that.
4.
Yeah. So I began to research the next generation. I began to jump into the psychology of the next generation, the motives and intentions of the next generation, behavioral studies, cultural studies, child psychology, counseling things. I really began to try to become an expert in the next generation. It's funny, a lot of student pastors work with the next generation, but almost operate out of their resource of time. Like, I've been with them for a while, so I know them, which is kind of true, but there's such a broader scope to them. So I really started to dig into understanding the nuances of the next generation. That way, when I began to partner with parents, I had something of value to bring, and I could give them some language. And I've been amazed over the past 7 years or so, as I've tried to partner with parents, beginning to understand how receptive parents were to that. I thought they might have some walls up, like, who's this young guy? He's not going to know anything. But it's actually the opposite. most parents have two core desires. I want to be a better parent, but I'm not sure how to do that. And so all of a sudden, when you have someone who can translate language and culture and behavior into structured categories of here's why, here's probably what's going on, here's how to approach that, let's partner together, it becomes an invaluable resource. So I've actually seen over the past 7 years, parents really, really are desperate to understand what's happening in the lives of their students, because most parents are trying to be the best parent they can be, but it's impossible to keep up because adolescent culture is a global phenomenon that is evolving faster than anything else on the planet, even faster than technology. Adolescent culture changes in the blink of an eye. So most parents feel lost in the wind. So for guys who work with teenagers as a profession to come in and say, what if we could understand this together so that you can be the best parent you can be and the best discipler you can be, then man, it's a win-win. So to answer your question, Jonathan, here's what I've learned through, trying to partner with parents and really studying the next generation. Over the past 50 or 60 years, there's been 3 mega cultural shifts among adolescent culture. In the 1950s, adolescent culture was pretty much viewed as the age of 13 to the age of 18. And at 18, you're an adult and you're ready to go to war. You're ready to grow up. You're ready to vote. You can smoke tobacco. You can do all these things at the age of 18. Well, what happened is post World War II, a lot of young men came home and their worldview was wrecked because of what they had seen or maybe what they had done. And culture did not have language yet for things like post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so a lot of young soldiers turned to substances. Alcoholism began to go on the rise. And also they came home to a lot of broken homes. A lot of adultery and affairs were happening here in the States while they were gone. And so for the first time, the American family structure began to be splintered. And so this huge identity crisis began to happen. In the 1950s, the number one thought on the mind of adolescents was, who am I? What's my identity? And that pretty much stayed consistent until the 1970s, where the next undertone took place. And in the 1970s, you have some, political things going on, some cover-ups and interesting things going on. You have different camps in terms of war and peace movements, things like that. It's also the birthplace of modern-day student ministry. Jim Rayburn, a gentleman out of Texas, created something that we now call Young Life, where he took the gospel into schools. Churches picked up on that and was like, man, what if we began targeting teenagers? So student ministry was born in the 70s. And corporate mentality started to go on the rise in the 70s. All these behavioral profiling tests started to go on the rise in the 70s. Production started to go on the rise. And so the number one thought on the mind of an adolescent became, what is my purpose? It was no longer identity, it was value. What's my purpose? How do I contribute? Which camp am I going to join? How do I make a name for myself? What's my purpose here? And that stayed consistent all the way until about the year 2000, when the next mega cultural shift on the mind of adolescents took place. And that is consistent up to date. In the year 2020, it remains the same, but the dominant thought of the mind on the mind of an adolescent is, where do I belong? Culturally, adolescents are desperate to belong. It's a tribal mentality. And it really was in partnership. If you guys remember the year 2000, Will, how old were you in the 2000?
9.
Nice.
9 years old?
J Monk, you were 20 in 2000?
25.
Something around there?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, if you guys remember the year 2000, Y2K, right? It was like everyone had a scare. The banks were going to like get tricked by the 00 at the end and everything was going to shut down and nothing happened. But also in the year 2000, what really took off was the internet. And that started to make a lot of progress and people began embracing it as a, not just this weird or cool thing, but as a normal part of everyday life. And with the partnership of the internet came new advancements in technology. Just a few years later, I think 4 years later, 2004 was the introduction of the iPhone 1 first generation. Maybe it was 2006. I can't. 2006. So 6 years later, iPhone comes into play, and now you have the world in your hand. And all of a sudden, adolescent culture began to get so splintered and fractured because it was no longer bound by geography. It wasn't bound by what high school you go to, what town you live in, what neighborhood you live in. Now you have access to the world at your fingertips in an instant because of the advancements in technology. And so all of a sudden, belonging, ironically, became less. The more connected we became on a global scale, the less connected we actually felt on a personal scale. And so belonging began to be this deep-seated desire because adolescent culture became so fractured out. And so a student today desires to belong more than anything. And there's some catch-22s there because the way that they try to belong is through a digital means. But I think you can have connectivity digitally, but not community digitally. And so most students engage very strongly. The average screen time is crazy for students, but engage very strongly with a digital space, and yet they feel lonely and empty. In fact, research is showing that because a student desires to belong, one of the things they will try to do is to create experiences just so that they have something to share in the digital space. And when you're creating experiences just so that you can share them, eventually you begin to fake your experiences just so that you can share them. Because there's such a fear of, what if I don't have anything to share? If I don't share, no one will see me. If they don't see me, I won't belong. I've got to be an influencer in the digital space, which is why it's not uncommon for teenage girls to wake up early, put on makeup, get the perfect lighting in their room, so on and so forth, then crawl back into bed, take a selfie or a dozen selfies, and then choose from one of those dozen. Just woke up, like ready to face the day. No, you didn't just wake up. You got ready for an hour to take that photo in which you presented your perfect world to the rest of us. So we're faking experiences just so that we can share them because we so strongly desire to belong. The negative repercussions of that is we've begun to be convinced that life can be edited. What I say and how I look and my experiences can all be edited. And so many students suffer from a virtual landscape of falseness or shallowness because they don't, they no longer really know what genuine experiences or failures feel like, and therefore they're adequately unprepared to deal with those things, which then leads to a lot of emotional problems that we're seeing in life, such as anxiety, worry, depression, suicide, things like that. So the loneliness compared with the inauthenticity of these experiences is leading to some cataclysmic numbers in terms of anxiety right now, which is kind of a marker for this current generation. So all that to say, I would say belonging is the desire of adolescence. And when I talk to parents about that desire and how it actually plays out, why they do what they do, and how loneliness can create different behaviors in students. 8th grader going into ninth grade year, their social structure was stable in 8th grade. They're the top of middle school, and now they're at the bottom of high school. That's a social structure collapse. So they're going to be acting differently. They're desperate to find, who are my people? Where do I belong? 12th grader going into college, same thing. So as we partner with parents, helping them see the key identifiers of why these students or adolescents are doing these things. And it's really, really interesting because this generation does not think themselves into new ways of acting. They act themselves into new ways of thought. And so they will try on behaviors long before they actually believe in what they're doing because they're desperate to belong. So if a social group accepts me and that social group wears certain clothing and talks certain ways and does certain things, I'll adopt the behaviors. Even though I don't necessarily believe in them, I'll adopt them because I want to belong. But if I behave long enough, eventually I begin to believe in what I'm doing. It's very different from generations prior.
Will, I see you leaning forward. Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Will, I love Will. He's got the gift of brevity. He can answer a question like that. So, Will.
Sometimes it's the curse of brevity.
Hey, dude, we love you, man. Hey, real quick, Matt, before we move to the next question here, as you're, we're talking about partnering with parents, and we talked about it a second ago. Obviously, we're all parents, the three of us youth pastors. But our kids are like I think Will's oldest daughter is like 4. My oldest is 4 as well. Trent's what, 4? And so the oldest that we all have is 4. And do you ever feel intimidated or like, it's just not really my place when you're speaking to parents who have high schoolers who are significantly older than your kids?
Mm-hmm. Yes and no, man. Like I think, our profession is a really strange profession. Like we've given ourselves to the next generation. We've kind of pressed pause in some ways on our social circles. I don't know about you guys, but like friends my age are marginally less in number than the number of teenagers that I hang out with, right? Like it's a weird balance, but that's what we've given ourselves to. So in some ways, you have to approach parents with all humility in the world and understand that it doesn't matter how much you know about teenagers or the next generation. They're the expert on their particular child, period. But that's actually also an advantage. So usually like what I try to, the elevator pitch I give to parents is, you're the expert on your particular child, and you see your child through every phase of life, from birth all the way to graduation into college. You see them through every phase of life.
That's good.
But we see every child in this one phase of life. And so we consider ourselves experts in this phase. And so what if we could combine your expertise of your child and our expertise of this phase and really walk hand in hand and create the strongest possible strategy to disciple them? And, typically a parent is really well receiving of that. Like I can't recall one negative experience where a parent has rejected any resourcing or information or equipping that I might be able to offer about the middle school and high school phases of life.
Oh, that's good, man. It's encouraging. Thanks for speaking to that. I think a lot of people will be encouraged by that, that they're experts in the big overall, and we're experts in this one phase. Speaking about maybe more specifically, not just a phase, but this season, quarantine, this unprecedented, I can't even say the word, uncharted waters.
Good. That's good.
Thank you. Now these are hard times, and so there's a lot that I think the three of us have been learning about student culture during this time. Will, let's go to you first, just maybe real quick. What is something that you've been observing or learning about students now? And then Matt, I want to go back to you with the same question.
I think that students right now are having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that following Jesus isn't easy right now. And certainly everybody and students do go through hard times of following Jesus and various things, but like at least there's an easy side of it where I can come to youth group, and there's a fun side of it. There's an attractive side to it maybe. And right now the attractive side of following Jesus is gone. And so now it really is on them. And so I think like if they're going to pursue Jesus, it's going to be on them. It's going to be on their initiative. There's going to be some ownership. And so where I think students are kind of struggling right now is going, I've really tried to make my decisions to follow Jesus, made my decisions to read the Bible, to pray. And then I've learned something. My decisions don't last long. And so I think there's the weight of failure and is leading to, I'm not even going to try anymore. Why try? If my relationship with God doesn't look like other people's and it can't look like other people's, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. And so I think the fear of failure is leading students to not even try anymore, because for the first time it's not easy. And so I think that's one thing that students are, at least our students are facing through this quarantine thing as it pertains at least to their faith. Am I going to keep going even though I keep failing? is it even worth it to keep going and to keep trying if failure seems to be the most predictable outcome?
No, thanks, Will. Matt, what about you? What have you learned about students during this time?
Yeah. Will, that's a good word, man. I think one of the generational markers of Gen Z, this current generation that we're all working with, there's kind of 6 generational markers that have been landed on by researchers. One of them is that Gen Z has pretty much concluded that real safety, true safety, is a myth. It's not possible. And there's some contributing factors there, but they're born either right before.
Did we lose Matt?
And Matt, you froze for just a second, but I think you'll.
Did I break up? Are you guys still?
Yeah, we're still here.
The safety is a myth.
Hey, sorry. I broke up.
You're back.
I'm back. So they believe safety is a myth, and there's some contributing factors. They were either born right before 9/11 happened or after 9/11 happened, which most of our students are after 9/11, post 9/11. So they were born into a world that's been at war in the Middle East their entire life. They've been born into a country that's been at war their entire life.
Good observation.
2008, the Great Recession happened right around some cognitive awareness for most of our students. They're really beginning to understand and perceive the world around them in deeper ways. And they're noticing mom and dad fighting more often, fighting about money. We're not buying as many things. They seem worried. Anxiety has risen in the house. Those were contributing, impacting factors to a young child. And so they've just kind of formed this worldview. Yeah, real safety is not true. Like you can't place your trust in systems, the government. There's nothing like real safety. And you see this most expressed in Hollywood. Look at how many in this generation, look at how many post-apocalyptic movie franchises have been launched. Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Divergent, The Walking Dead, amongst many other zombie things have been like, the worldview is the world is ending, but what if we banded together to survive? But even that's not much hope, because look at how grim it is. Like, that's an undercurrent worldview. I think COVID-19 has amplified some of that worldview, in which our students have basically said, like, the world's ending, man. Like, the world's ending. Which, in a spiritual sense, yes, eventually we do believe there is a second coming and Jesus is making all things new and all new things, and there'll be a new heaven and new earth. But in a very realistic sense, a crisis does not define the end of the world. And so I think it's very easy for Gen Z to get zoomed into what's happening in the moment without zooming out to remember a few core factors: that God is in control, that there is a redemptive story happening, and that we get to be a part of it, and that no matter the circumstances, life is moving forward, and there's a lot to celebrate in that and be thankful for, and a lot to do in that. I think the American culture is very comfort driven, and so things like this tend to cripple the mentality of so many of our students, which is like, I just want it to be back how it was. I want to be able to drive to Starbucks and get my drink. I want to be able to go to school and see my friends. I want to be able to do this or do that. And none of those desires are wrong. But when those desires unfulfilled create like a bleak worldview in which life is ending, then it does reveal maybe we've elevated those desires to not simply things to be thankful for, but in our minds, necessities that we had to have, when in reality we didn't. And so it's hard to break out of that understanding. So I think one of the greatest things we can do right now for our students is offer a message of hope, in that Jesus endured suffering, and he understands every ounce of suffering and hardship that we're experiencing. But Jesus also delivered hope, that suffering and a negative circumstance or a crisis does not have the final word on our life or hope in this life. Jesus does, and he has given us eternal hope.
That's good. So, that's good, man. We're about out of time. Will, Matt, anything else you want to say before we sign off?
I think just to connect a little bit of what I said to a little bit of what you said is I think where students feel right now in their faith is they feel like they're hopeless. Not that there's no hope in the world, but there's no hope for me, at least in living the kind of life that I want to as a Christian. And I think that's where students are at right now, or at least a lot of students. And parents, for that matter. Parents want to be impacting their kids, and right now with social media, it seems like everybody else is doing all cool art projects and family gatherings. All my family does is fight. It feels hopeless, and I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Yeah, I know. One thought I just had to before we wrap up, Matt, is when you're talking about the selfie, the girl who takes the picture like she just woke up, it reminds me of something that Will and I have talked about comparison, that if we compare ourselves, we'll never know who we are, just who we aren't, and how social media can be such a trap for that Will and I have talked about this, that we compare what's real in our life to the filtered life of other people. And so I think parents and leaders and maybe some students may even watch this, but primarily parents, leaders, I think it's good to remember that what's going on in your own home, and it's easy to assume that things are better in someone else's home and to fall into that trap of comparison. So I think that's one good thing to remember. And then also, Matt, with what you talked about, that Jesus knows our sufferings, I thought about your favorite book, which is, what's your favorite book?
The book of Philippians, man.
I know.
Doesn't get better. Doesn't get better.
With me. He loves Hebrews.
Yeah, Hebrews is my book.
And Hebrews 4 speaks about that Jesus is able to sympathize with us in our weakness. So parents, leaders, let's remember the one who can sympathize with us in our weakness. So be a great passage to go maybe spend some time in, Hebrews 4. I believe it's 14 to 16, somewhere in there. So, well, hey, thanks guys for your time. I hope to do this again. Will, grateful for you. Matt, you as well. And so parents, leaders, hope you're encouraged by this. And then if you were, maybe share this with someone else. So we love you guys. Have a great day.
Yeah. Good to see you, brothers.
Yep.